Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Tea on the Tea Trans in Conversation. My name is Tobi Evans. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them. And I'm really excited tonight to be joined by Oliver Ross. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're filming on the lands of the Boonwurrung, Boonwurrung, and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present. As I said, tonight our guest is Oliver Ross. Oliver works in film and theatre and also has really gorgeous curly hair. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you. I have only cut it once since lockdown started 2 years ago and just thought I would keep the trend going.
Very impressive. It's gorgeous curls. So, firstly, what are your gender pronouns and what's your star sign?
I'm a he, him. I use he, him, and I'm a Sagittarius.
Ooh, Sagittarius. You're our first Sagittarius.
Yeah.
We've had an overrepresentation of Geminis so far.
I mean, I guess that's fitting for like the sign of the twins, so.
Deep. Getting deep already. Love it. So, can you tell us a bit about you?
I kind of do a mix of things, very much jumping different roles and wearing many hats. I've mostly worked in film and theatre. Theatre for about 6 years now, film for probably about 3, 2 of which have been in COVID, so always a bit complicated. And then also worked in more directly in trans advocacy for the last 2 years. And very much mixing above and below the line, so doing stuff like writing and development and script editing, and then doing a lot of stuff with crew roles, particularly lighting design, costume design.
So we will talk about this a bit more later on, but what do you mean by above and below the line?
So it's particularly used in film more so than theatre. It's the types of roles that you'd see on a poster, so particularly directors, producers, lead actors. I think it varies a bit project to project, but those tend to be the main ones.
So are those above the line or below the line?
Those are above the line.
It's like what you see is above the line.
Yeah,
and what
definitely.
you don't see is below the line.
Pretty much.
So
and
we're above the line right now?
Yeah, it's very much an iceberg. Like, it's normally a relatively small amount of creatives above the line, and just massive numbers of like a massive working machine below hand.
I'm really looking forward to hearing more about all of that, but first I'd love to hear about your gender journey.
I think I'd always been aware that the gender I was assigned at birth wasn't comfortable for me. As far back as I could remember, so probably to about 5 or 6 years old. I don't think I was really conscious of having a name for it until about probably 18 or 19 in year 12. But I think particularly in primary school, I think because my upbringing was quite gender neutral anyway, I only really noticed it socially with other kids and less at home.
You felt like gender wasn't really like an issue at home, but like in kind of public, you noticed that kind of gendering.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Even in terms of like looking back on pictures, like at one point I had my hair shaved really short. I got the nickname Walshy Boy, which was my surname at the time. In retrospect, a cis girl probably wouldn't have like made that their nickname and then turned that into their email address.
Yeah.
For like 10 years. So that was probably a sign looking back. And like even back from being very young, noticing that like if there was any type of toy that wasn't gendered, it would always be gendered male by default, particularly if it was something that I was kind of using as a mouthpiece.
What do you mean by that?
I guess even in terms of like, like little kids playing with soft toys and teddies and stuff, it feels like the character that was kind of representing me, or like that I was following through a journey, noticing there was mostly male, and that like the types of characters in books that I think were almost designed to connect to me, particularly as the nerdy frizzy-haired child kind of didn't in quite the same way, or they did, but from a much more kind of external perspective rather than like I see myself as this person or could.
So you said that you kind of started to find language to articulate how you were feeling at about like 18. What helped you kind of get to that point?
I think I'd seen bits and pieces online for probably only a year or two beforehand. I was actually in my year 12 English class studying Shakespeare, and there was this Shakespeare play we were studying, Coriolanus, it's basically a political thriller set in Rome. Everyone's a terrible person. The villain is like one of the only likable people, and all of the protagonists hate each other. It was really interesting because there was this very hyper-masculine character who, like everyone else in the play, is just an awful person. It was really interesting with the discussions around gender and privacy, particularly because in ancient Rome, for example, public life was very much a masculine thing. Privacy was seen as more of a feminine virtue. So it was really interesting seeing this very hyper-masculine character who was very fiercely and protectively private, and kind of the discussions that came out of that. And I realised that when I was writing essays about that I'd been writing those same essays about very masculine characters with feminine attributes. I'd been writing like the identical essay for probably about 6 years.
Oh, wow.
And that I just kept doing it for everything. I think we were studying Jane Eyre at the same time. I wrote the exact same essay in that too.
So what I'm hearing is self-plagiarism is a way of finding yourself.
Essentially. And yeah, I think it just kind of went from there. I think around that time had the words to describe myself. And then I kind of put it on the back burner for about 3 years, particularly starting off at university. I think particularly as an autistic man, I found the transition from having a sense of structure and stability that I was really familiar with, moving into an entirely new world, so much just went on the back burner. So I think it was only for a couple of years later that I kind of, I don't think I ended up physically transitioning in the ways that I wanted to until I felt that I had to, in the terms of like my mental health getting worse.
So you kind of started to have some like gender thoughts around 18, and then you started uni, and you're like, I got to like do some other things now. And then you had the kind of time and space to start medically transitioning after that.
Yeah, definitely.
And how have things been since then?
I think what really struck me, particularly the year afterwards, was, I guess, how much easier it was to be motivated for things. Because I think particularly because I'm very much a planner, I love planning for things in advance. Even if the plan completely changes, I like having something there as scaffolding. And there were a couple of years there where I couldn't do it at all. Like I found like planning the next week hard, the next month hard. I genuinely couldn't. I found it hard to like imagine life myself 10 years in the future, and the idea of like growing old, realizing that it was actually unthinkable and I couldn't picture anything at all. And so I think it really stood out the year after transition. I kind of, partially also because I just started HRT and had a bit of an energy boost for a couple of months, but like I went completely over the top in the other direction. I think I did like 40 creative projects that year.
Wow.
A lot of them at the same time, which while in retrospect was a bad idea, I think it's because I had, and I've learned to manage that since there, I had that energy and that motivation and that excitement for doing things and like being able to see a future for myself. And yeah, it was just, as much as I think I used up most of that extra energy I had, it was good to have, that excitement and that motivation again.
And something that you mentioned when we were speaking this week was that you started doing trans activism around the same time you started transitioning. What was that like?
So I think I started HRT in August. I came out in October, and I think I started my first role in trans advocacy that I think it was the next February after that.
It's a baby trans.
And had like a couple of counts beforehand, very, very much baby trans. Well, I think that's been very important in my journey, and that I'm really proud of the work that I've done and the people that I've gotten to work with, and like being able to support other people and their work. I think if I'd done it again, I think I did it too early, because I think in particular I started working, I guess, in community spaces and doing facilitating and stuff before I really had the chance to be a community member. I think particularly too, starting out, I was about 21, for example. I think I was often working with people who are a fair bit older than me and who have, say, they were working in youth groups and they were facilitating youth groups. And I was the same age as the people they were working with. And so I think because of that and because of navigating conflicts of interests, I think I really aged out of most youth spaces before I got the chance to be in them. Well, there's been massive improvements in there over the last few years. There's less spaces and less support for people, particularly in that gap between 25 and probably even into people's 50s or 60s once there starts to be support for older trans people. But there's a massive gap of decades and decades where it's much trickier when people come into their identities in their adulthood.
There's a lot of funding for LGBTIQA youth, which is fantastic, but there is that kind of, once you get to 21 or 25, like, where do you go after that? So it's really difficult. And I can imagine like, doing your activism at the same time as doing your own transition. That would have been so much to, be like navigating who you are and kind of working with other people who are doing that as well. And it's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so interesting hearing things talked about on, I guess, like a very public way, or like a way around legal issues when I was still kind of coming into them myself. So like, we should focus on this thing to support people at this stage of their transition, or like who are having these issues. It's like, I haven't even got to that yet.
Yeah. Wait, I'm not having those issues yet. I don't get it. Yeah.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So I think now I'm kind of navigating, I guess, coming out of a more direct advocacy role, giving myself some time before, I guess, kind of trying to explore who I am as a community member as well.
And how are you, like what routes are you finding to kind of figure yourself out as a community member?
I think at the moment it's still been on like a one-to-one basis in terms of like, I think even the last couple of years it's been easy within friendship groups, particularly supporting friends who are questioning their gender identity and kind of trying to support them there. I think I really haven't gone into many like trans-specific spaces or queer-specific spaces yet. I think that's also just me like overdoing my work schedule again. So, but yeah, I guess in a similar way, it's often been a very project-to-project basis in terms of like, how do you explore trans storytelling with other trans people and kind of going from there. I think that's a common thing more broadly because I think like a lot of people in theatre and film, a large majority of my social circle is from other people in theatre and film. So yeah, I think it's kind of exploring those places where like friendship and like creative work and like advocacy overlap.
So something else that you mentioned that made me really interested to talk about more was you were saying that when you first started transitioning or even like thinking about transitioning, you didn't really feel like a macho kind of person, but you were feeling like you were a binary man. So you kind of had to navigate that. Well, I'm a man, but I'm not like much. So like, could you tell me a bit more about that?
I think particularly because even from high school, I think I very much made myself not even the mum friend necessarily, but like the therapist friend. And that I always, that like my focus was always being very trying to be supportive of other people. And like I'd never been a particularly loud person. And even in terms of very much having nerdy friend groups and stuff. But I think what kind of helped me over time was also realizing that it wasn't, I guess that if I'd been cisgender, I don't think that would have been me anyway. Like particularly of my upbringing being quite gender neutral. My father has a bunch of very reckless, stupid stuff, but is not necessarily a macho man. Like he works in like environmental advocacy. He did lots of stuff with kind of more like adventuring activities and like outdoor stuff. So like I don't think the idea of like like the stereotypical like blokey lifestyle of like football or like going to pubs and stuff, which is very much a thing that can be much broader than that anyway. I don't think that would have been me either way. And yeah, I think it's been something I've been exploring over time too, in terms of like navigating how I kind of express myself through clothing too. And like even with like growing out my hair, for example, having short hair initially was really gender euphoric for me. Like I think one of the moments that kind of hit me was I was backstage for like, I think like a year 11 theatre production, and there were these terrible wigs backstage, like the ones that stay in the drama room for like 20 or 30 years. Yeah. They probably shouldn't be worn. They're not super sanitary. No. Very, very oily. And there was this one, almost like a Justin Bieber style haircut, and my hair was actually similar to this at the time. I remember putting it on and actually recognising myself in the mirror for the first time.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And so it was really interesting that so I cut my hair very short, I think a week after I'd graduated high school. And then
drama. I love it.
Yeah, and then kept it quite short for a few years. And so it was only really in lockdown I felt comfortable growing it out again and realising, I think particularly because I'd started growing out facial hair at a similar time, maybe if lockdown lasts another 2 years, I'll actually fill in at some point. But yeah, and actually seeing that I did feel comfortable growing it out again and that was a part of me that I had enjoyed and now could also find affirming.
As a fellow curly head person, I've definitely had a similar experience in terms of like cutting my hair very short, and now I'm like, well, I'm more comfortable, so like maybe I want it to be a bit longer because curls are so pretty. Like they're just gorgeous on everyone.
And I'm just too lazy to cut it regularly too. Like I can't be bothered going to a hairdresser like every couple of weeks.
When my hair was that length, I got it cut like 3 times a year, and I was like, this is great. And it was like I would go to Queensland, it was like $30, so I was like, I'm living the life.
Pretty much, particularly too now that I can't get the student haircuts anymore.
So we've talked a bit about your work and particularly your kind of work in trans spaces and in the community. I wanted to hear a bit about how you kind of balance being like a professional trans and also like a trans person, because it can be really difficult to be like working on an area that you are passionate about, but also like is really tied to your identity. So I'd love to hear about how that's been for you and how you navigate that kind of always on tension.
I think that's something I actually found surprising about advocacy, because I think in arts it's always a thing about, monetizing your passions. Yep. And the idea that people, people are so passionate about the work they're creating, the stories they're telling, that your work and your passions and your dreams and your identity is always quite closely tied together. So I thought that I knew what I was expecting going into things, but I think having only your identity tied to your work was a lot more intense than I was expecting. So I think if anything, having storytelling still gives a level of distance that I'd actually find a bit of relief. So I think it was really interesting too in terms of, I think particularly the first 2 years, I was very rarely the only trans person on a project. So I'd often be telling people with predominantly trans groups or even exclusively trans groups. So I think I've been quite lucky in that position. I think it's been quite a new thing to start being created too. But I think at times too, I think initially I can be reluctant going into spaces where I am the only trans person unless it's been, I guess, specifically requested for that reason. Like I'd be more comfortable going into a role if they're saying like, we've got a trans character, would like to talk to you about them. If it's just a broader story, I think I often won't bring up, can this be a trans person if I'm the only trans person in a room? In terms of like being willing to go into those roles, but knowing what I'm stepping in for and being able to set my own boundaries there.
Yeah, I imagine it's like quite difficult to be like, well, is this even safe? Like if you're the only person. And I often find that that's like represented in kind of films. Like when you see a trans person in film, as I'm sure you're aware, like it's always like there's like one trans person, and I'm like, no, we come in pack. Like you get like a pack of 3 at least,
Absolutely. I think that's been really fascinating too, doing stuff like pre-screening for queer film festivals, because it's even more common in documentary than it is in feature films. I think that's potentially because the stories that like really stand out and really like attention grabbing to people outside of those communities are the ones where a person is quite isolated.
Yeah.
Because, that's it's more noteworthy, it's more noticeable. So I think it can often be people who are a bit more isolated, a bit more vulnerable, who end up in those positions. So I think if anything, there has to be more, not caution, but I think it takes a lot of work to do a documentary in a safe way.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely improvements that have been being done there. Yeah, it's interesting, like working in documentary, but no, it's something that I'll be quite cautious to approach myself from a participant perspective. So I really try and help that inform my work. So it's interesting in terms of so much of creating work is a collaborative experience too. It's also seeing which kind of roles people are already in and which would be great to get more people in, for example. Like there's been so many programs really focusing on transgender writers and transgender performers and people, I guess, with, I think the thing with above the line roles is because they're very visible. They're the people that are leading a project, they're leading the marketing for a project and who are often quite active on social media, for example. So they will both get all of the positive attention of the project and also all of the backlash of the project. Whereas below the line in particular, there's a lot more flexibility there in terms of, I guess, how much you want a project to define you. For example, backstage in theatre, for example, has been a much more common space for trans people for years and years and years. They're the roles that you don't have to be in the spotlight, so it doesn't have to be safe to be in the spotlight in terms of stuff like stage management, for example. So I think now it's almost seeing, I guess, doing more stuff promoting both of these areas, particularly now there's a crew shortage more broadly in all of the industries at the moment because, it's been tricky for artists the last couple of years. So a lot of people, if they can move over to other areas they have, particularly people in terms of like, like if you're a producer or a production manager or film and theatre, you can go pretty much anywhere. So there's a skill shortage there. And particularly, I think, as a technician doing a lot of work in lighting, it's really interesting that it's still quite a male-dominated field. It's still quite a cis field. And even, like, as a trans creator, there's only a handful of trans directors I know. A lot of them are just coming up and emerging themselves. So it's interesting now we've got the people who've written the stories to tell, but there's less people to facilitate that so far, and there's less people to support them in other roles, for example. Because I think as like a trans person in arts, for example, there's so many factors across so many departments. Like as a costume designer, for example, I really want to work with people to get, I guess, their sense of comfort levels, both in terms of whether a person is trans or whether, I guess even more broadly, the fact that as an actor, it's their body that they bring into a role. And so really making sure that it's what they're comfortable with.
So in terms of that, thinking about bodies, we have talked about transness a lot already, but you have also mentioned that you're a neurodiverse person. So I'd love to hear how you feel like those two identities interact.
I think in a lot of really different ways. I think if anything, it's made the last few years easier in terms of like, I guess looking through my own socialization as female and seeing what elements of male socialization am I interested in, what kind of things would I like to avoid, because learning socialization has always been a conscious process. It's never it's never just been instinctive. So I think it's been easier that way. And even in terms of like the way that I think through things, like I think when I, in those 3 years I was working out what I wanted to do transition-wise, I just kept a document open tracking like every single thing that gave me like, oh, this could be a gender thing. I think I ended up with like 50,000 words or something. Most of them were dot points.
Oh my goodness. So you got like a Word document for your transition.
Pretty much. I had Word documents, I had spreadsheets, I had because that's how I approached everything else. And I was just kind of doing that over time.
Something that I found really interesting that you said was how you learned how to kind of like, live in the world, when you were being perceived as a woman, and then now you've kind of had to like be like, oh God, now I have to like
absolutely. It's
manually learn.
It's a very different script. I think it has been interesting though, because I think, there's lots of articles in terms of the way that like autism is underdiagnosed in women, because it often comes across in different ways. And so I think it's been really interesting that I don't think from a gender perspective I'd be very different if I'd been a cisgender man. I think I would have been socialised quite differently, particularly socially. And like I think one thing that really stood out for me, I guess because my younger sister, for example, is autistic too, and she was also always very open about her passions and interests, and she got a bit of hate for it. And so I think looking back on that, I thought, I've seen how this doesn't work for one person. I'm going to do the exact opposite. I'm going to hide all of my interests completely. I'm not going to talk to anyone about them at all. And I'm going to present myself in not even in a gender way, but in the most neutral way possible, in terms of being very agreeable and not giving people anything to cling on to that they could use as a target. And so I think the idea of transitioning and making this very public part, this very private part of my life very public, and the fact that if I wanted to keep the same people in my life, that there wasn't really an option to be private, was something that was utterly terrifying to me, and the antithesis of what I'd been trying to do for 20 years. So I think that having to be open about a part of myself and choosing how to do that almost made it easier over time in terms of, if this is what I feel comfortable expressing about myself, maybe I can, openly chat to people about other things I'm interested in. It's very difficult to exist as a trans person and be neutral because your existence isn't viewed as a neutral thing.
It's political.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if I'm viewed as like intrinsically political, then like I might as well be able to just chat to people about my hobbies.
So we've talked a lot about your identity, but I'd love to hear more about your work in theatre and film, because that's like so interesting. We've kind of touched on is the importance of having trans people in the room. And I'd love to kind of hear what you kind of see as the state of like trans storytelling more broadly at the moment. So like what's going on at the moment and like what's changing and what needs to change.
I think it's changed drastically, particularly from 6 years ago. Like when I was in high school, it just wasn't a thing that was talked about. And now we've got people who are much younger than I was when I was transitioning, who aren't even trans themselves, who have that vocabulary and have that interest in supporting other people. And I think that's been such a major thing in terms of, I think a lot of trans stuff in media went to online platforms first, where there was, I guess, when they had to worry about appealing to a lower number of people. And so it was okay for things to be more divisive. Like I spent so long just watching trans YouTubers. Actually, before I even realised I was trans, I remember seeing like a couple of videos and feel like, oh, that's interesting, filing that away for later. But yeah, like there's been so much online content that's been so vital. It's often been, I guess, very personal in terms of like people documenting their own transition, what happens 7 years down the line when they guess that they've resolved that chapter of their life, and also the fact in order to support people, it has to be quite directly. So it seems like the burnout rate, particularly for transgender YouTubers, is quite high. So how can we, I guess particularly too, because people end up being put on a platform, how do we make those stories without having, I guess with the burden of representation, it's always tricky enough in a fictional medium. We don't want to have that exclusively on people's real lives as well. So I think in particular now we're in like a time of firsts, because there's so few stories that have been told, and they're often quite similar stories in terms of things, it either ends in transition or it ends in death, or both. So, but that means because there's such a huge variety of stories that have never been told of trans people, so everything is still fresh and new. Like I remember over the last couple of years, there's been more of a push with, because often queer stories have been very urban. Now there's been lots of stories about people, transitioning and then going back to their family in like a rural town. And that's been a trend for the last few years now. And so now there's so much stuff in terms of, particularly as we move into like genre fiction, for example, like there's still space for like the first, trans fantasy, particularly in feature films, for example. There's honestly so few movies made starring trans people as the leads that they could all be on the film circuit at the same time. There's less than 10 of them each year. Most of the time there's 2 or 3. So yeah, there's so much space to really play around with literally anything else because there'll be an audience. It's like if you want to have, a niche genre combining thing and be really experimental in other things, there's going to be an interest there because there's been nothing else. Or if you want to like take a trope that's really old or like a cliche that wouldn't work in other mediums, there's a way to completely reinvent it.
The idea of it being like a time of first just like gives me goosebumps just to think about. But it's also such an interesting point that like you can, if you just kind of look at things through, I guess, like a trans lens, like you can freshen up, any like existing genre in really exciting and fun ways.
I think particularly too, once you get into stuff with multiple trans people as well, like there's almost nothing with people where both members of a couple are trans.
Yeah.
It's predominantly been stories of straight trans people, sometimes with previous relationships, sometimes with new ones. But yeah, like there's so little about trans people interacting with each other. And that's such an exciting space to be in now.
Well, that's what we're doing now.
I know.
With the future. Amazing. So to start wrapping up, what have we not talked about today that you are like frothing to talk about?
So where do you see how interviews have been and where would you like them to move away from and kind of move more into?
Are you asking me or are you like...
Yeah.
I'm going to answer this question in a really, really roundabout way, but I was recently like reading some Dude magazine, which is I don't know if you've heard of Dude magazine, but it basically was like in the early 2010s, and it was like a trans mass focused like Australian magazine, and I was just like reading it, and they were talking about like people's people who had been like in relationships with trans people. And also like trans people's just like various kind of experiences in like, different kinds of spaces like sex work and in porn and in like the kink community. And I was like, yeah, like I want to know more about trans people being hot. I want to hear about trans people being sexy in public, as we are also doing now. But like, I'm like, maybe that's my niche, but I would love to kind of move away from like trans people as this like sad, burdened, like unattractive creatures and just like really embrace the reality that trans people are really hot and really interesting and really like joyful creatures.
I think that really stands out too in terms of more stories and more opportunities for multiple trans people in the same space.
Yeah.
Because I think particularly when people are quite isolated, it's almost like the idea of like, why would you want to be with another trans person, and the perception that's almost like downgrading to like be with people who are like yourself. Or that, yeah, I think it's a different idea of like, what is the ideal person, or like even like a transition ideal or something. I think it's good that now it's moving more into, I guess, people, I guess, transitioning the way that they want to and like being with people the way that they want to.
Yeah, I think there's that kind of very straightforward like narrative of like, this is how it's done. But it's like bodies can be great in all different varieties.
I think even now there's more focus in terms of like trans people's stories being told for them as well, rather than I think often it kind of feels like that a person, they're not really a character, they're just like their transition is the catalyst for the story.
Yeah.
And the story is about how everyone else reacts to this thing. And they're just kind of, window dressing after they've stopped being the cause of events. So now I think there's been improvements in terms of treating people as actual characters.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I love that. So my last question for you is about trans joy, fittingly. So what is bringing you joy at the moment? It can be a big thing, small thing, anything at all.
I think now that after like 3 years of just being in like a dressing gown and tracksuit pants, the fact
Personal attack.
actually going back into my wardrobe and like playing around with different, like re-exploring, particularly like 2 years down the line, how my sense of self has changed in terms of like how I express myself. I think particularly too because I had top surgery recently, so that's kind of reevaluated the way I'm comfortable with different things as well. And like exploring different elements of like masculinity and also things that like I'd put away in a drawer for years because I guess I initially felt too feminine in them or too dysphoric in them, and being able to like revisit different things. So yeah, I think it's been exciting to like explore how things have been evolving.
I love that. Fashion is such an important vehicle for like being yourself, and you particularly always look so good. Like whenever I see you, I'm like, "Where's that from?" But where's like give me just like where everything's from.
It's very hard to find, so I keep a list and like here's like the 6 stores that stock extra small. I think particularly too also realizing that like I feel comfortable going into a store and being aware that like 70% of things won't fit me, but that's okay because I'll find the 30% somewhere else.
Yeah.
And even in terms of like adjusting things, like even when like before I transitioned, I've always been very short. And like I didn't have a pair of pants that like didn't go down to my toes until I was like 23.
Oh wow.
So yeah, being able to like be more conscious in terms of like what makes you comfortable and what you're kind of willing to adjust has been cool.
Well, that's all we have time for, unfortunately. My name is Dr. Tobi Evans. Our fabulous guest tonight has been Oliver Ross, and you are watching the Tea on the Tea Trans in Conversation.